In this video, we're going to be looking at the Komaflex-S, a rather unusual camera in that it is an SLR that takes 127 film. There weren't many well, there were several reflex cameras that took 127. I believe there was an Exacta back in the 30s that took 127. That was a reflex camera. That was, of course, a single lens reflex camera, not with pentaprism viewing, but with a focusing hood. And then, of course, there were numerous twin lens reflex cameras, both before World War II and in the post-war years as well. This particular model comes from Kowa, I got that right, of Japan, Kowa Optical. And although the company had marketed it as the first single lens reflex camera taking 127 film, that obviously wasn't correct. I think you could say it was the first Japanese single lens reflex camera made for 127 film that was marketed outside of Japan. So this camera shot 12 photos, each being 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters, meaning you had a square format. There is no portrait or landscape orientation with square format because it's still a square. When I received it, this camera had a dark green body covering, and in the course of trying to service it, most of the covering just sort of crumbled away, or in fact sort of melted away, so I had to replace it. I replaced it with a black covering, and recently I bought this gray leather kit, just a sheet of leather, and I've attached it. I think I might cut it again because I did sort of a sloppy job around the hood and on the bottom. So you can see how I sort of missed here and there, especially around these small feet. So I'm going to do that again, but this color scheme will remain. With the hood collapsed, it's actually quite a compact little camera. As I mentioned, this was first released in 1960. So this is the Komaflex-S. So the lens in this camera is non-interchangeable. It's 65 millimeters. It's an f2.8 lens. It is in fact a 4-element Tessar type lens. Real quick, we'll take a look around the camera and go over some of its features. So obviously up here you have the lens, and it focuses in a traditional manner. However, please notice that this is a front cell focusing camera, and it's always been discussed whether front cell focusing cameras are sharper than unit focusing cameras. In a unit focusing camera, the entire lens moves to and fro, either toward or away from the film plane. And in theory, a unit focusing lens should be sharper than a front cell focusing lens. In practice, I've never had a real issue with a front cell focusing lens. So on the side of the shutter here, you have a small synchronization post, and then you have 3 settings here. And they're activated by just moving a small lever. M is manual flash synchronization. That would be bulb. X is electronic flash synchronization. And finally, V is a self-timer setting. V actually was stood for a German term. I'm not really sure what it is because I don't speak German. But it's funny how the Japanese replicated the use of the word, replicated the use of V when in fact, as I mentioned, it did stand for a German term. This small lever here tensions your shutter, and this allows you to change apertures. This camera uses the dreaded EV system, although I don't know if it's called EV or LV. In any case, the shutter speed and aperture are locked. So if you notice, when you turn the shutter speed selector, you also are turning the aperture. The only way to get off of that is to press in this small lever, and it will then allow you to, actually, you don't have to push it, but just pulling the lever in one direction or pushing it in the other allows you to then set the aperture manually. This shutter, I believe it's a Sakosha shutter. Yes, here it is. So this is a Sakosha branded shutter. Once again, that seems to be a popular make of shutter. It's very much like a CompUR shutter with speeds running from, it's very much like a CompUR, a synchro CompUR shutter with speeds running from 500 down to 1 second plus B. This is your shutter release, and if you notice, it does have a small socket for you to thread a cable. As I mentioned, this is a folding hood camera, and if you watch from the side, you'll see it sort of scissors inward and outward to collapse the hood. Just push in at the hinges while pulling down on the hood, and it will close. This camera has a small red dot, just like Leica, except this one says Kowa. If you push in on the small red dot, or actually if you push in above the small red dot, it will then raise the magnifier. If you keep pushing, it will lock in place, and then you have what's known as a sports finder. So to use a sports finder, you simply peer through this square. Of course, obviously you would have to pre-focus the lens, and then you would hold this up to your eye as you peer through this square and frame your shot, and then release it, and then trip the shutter when you're ready. Looks like there's a small dent here. So to raise the, to exit the sports finder mode, you simply push in the right side of the viewfinder, and that will then snap back into place. And I'll do that again. There. Once you're finished with the magnifier, just simply push it back into place. It has a tight spring, and it will pull it. You only have to push it part way, and then it will pull it all the way in and close. So these here are your strap lugs. Pretty beefy, actually. You can see they're attached with 2 screws on each side, so you know they're not coming loose. This is an accessory shoe. Now you're going to notice that with most accessory shoes, they always put the pin in the front, but with this accessory shoe, the pin is in the back. So if you did want to use a flash, for example, you would have to slide it front to back instead of back to front. And obviously this is not a hot shoe, so you would then need a flash synchronization cable to run from here into your flash synchronization post. These little things, oh, this is just simply for the back. So this little knob, you pull outward when you, during the whole insertion of, or loading of new film, and when you're removing your used film. Back of the camera is rather plain. On the bottom of the camera, there's quite a few things going on. One is a small little window that you use to help align your first shot. The second is this large knob that surrounds the tripod socket. Tripod socket is pretty much centered in alignment with the center of the camera, or the center of the lens, and of course, why wouldn't it be? Because this is a very narrow camera, and there would be no reason to offset it. This is your back lock. Turn it to the left to unlock the camera, turn it to the right to lock the camera, and you can see how it pulls this lever in or pushes it forward. Let's run around the rest of the camera real quickly. Nothing more on this side. On this side, we have a couple things going on. Here is a film minder dial. This really is just to tell you what speed film you have loaded in the camera, either color or black and white, and that's it. This camera has no meter, so you'll need an exposure meter, an exposure meter or exposure app in order to set your exposure accordingly, set your shutter speed and aperture accordingly. This serves 2 purposes. One is to reset the frame counter, and the second is to tension the shutter for the first frame. And here is your frame counter. Of course, there's no film loaded, so all you see is this little triangle. This lever performs several functions. One is that it lowers the mirror into focusing position, which would be a 45-degree angle from horizontal, and it also advances the film. I'll show you what this lever does in just a bit. So let's pop open the camera real quickly. Well, you turn it all the way to the right to lock the camera, and you turn it all the way to the left counterclockwise to open the camera. You can see that lever come up. Just pull that open, and then you probably will have to pop the back, depending on the condition of your camera. You might have to actually pop it open like this. Now, this camera, in fact, does use foam seals, and I had to replace them. And it just runs the on the outside edge of the camera, back. Film is fed from the bottom to the top. And you'll see as I turn this, you can see the take-up spool turn at the same time. Okay, here's your pressure plate. The pressure plate for this camera is very tightly sprung, and I'm using a fair amount of pressure in order to depress it. And of course, the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against these film rails, so when you take your photo, you get as sharp an image as possible, as sharp a photo as possible, always dependent upon the lens that is taking the photograph to be of sufficient quality to record a sharp image. The Komaflex has a very specific set of procedures that you have to follow when you load film and shoot with this camera. So let me go through the whole thing right now. So if you were to load film into the camera, I don't have any film at the moment, but if you were, first you'd unlock the back, hold open. Normally you'll have an empty spool here, you'll take it out and then you'll transfer it up here. You put your fresh roll film into here, pull out the leader, insert it into one of these slots here, and wind it around so that it wraps around the take-up spool maybe once or twice. After it's securely fastened to the take-up spool, now you can close the back. So close that lever, turn this dial all the way to the right. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to take this small button and you're going to push it. Oh, I'm sorry, not push it, but you're going to turn it counterclockwise. Or turn to the left until you uncover, till this arrow is hidden. Now you're going to continue to advance the film until 1 shows up here in the small red window. Once 1 is shown up, now take this button and push it toward the back of the camera and you'll notice that it's going to reset to this small little red triangle. Now you're going to continue advancing the film until 1 shows up in the window. Of course, I don't have any film, so that's not going to happen. Once 1 shows up in the window, you can stop advancing the film. Now it's time to tension the shutter. All you really need to do now is just tension the shutter, and you're good to go. After you take your photograph, you would then advance the film until number 2 shows up here in the small window. Once number 2 shows up, all you really have to do is to tension the shutter. There should be no reason for you to use this small switch here on the side ever again while you're shooting your film. And you continue to do that until you reach number 12. After you've shot your final roll of film, then you'll just simply continue to advance the film until it unwraps from the feed spool. If at any point this stops, just press your shutter release and you can continue to do that. You will hear it release from what was your fresh roll of film, and then at some point you'll hear it flapping around inside the film chamber. At that point, you'll turn it upside down, unlock the back, and here's where you will pull out that knob, remove your roll of film, make sure it's tightly wound, and then have it processed. Usually there's a small paper ring that you can lick, and it will then, it has some glue on the back. You'll lick it like you used to lick a stamp or an envelope, and then you'll just tape it around the spool. Always make sure that the film itself is tightly wound onto the spool. At that point, you might want to take your empty spool here and then transfer it up top. Now, if you wanted to dry fire the shutter, what you would need to do every time is first you would lower the mirror by pushing this forward once. You would pull back and hold this slide toward the rear of the camera, while you tension the shutter. So let's see what this camera weighs. This is not a real heavyweight camera, although it does have some solidity to it. It does feel like a solid camera, but not extremely heavy. And the Komaflex comes in at 1 pound 9 ounces. That's a bit heavier than I thought. I was expecting maybe 1 pound 4 ounces, 1 pound 5 at the most. So 1 pound 9 is a bit of a surprise to me. I can't recall what the problem was with this camera, but suffice to say it didn't work. It works fine now. It does have that quirky little thing where, there are certain steps that you have to take if you plan to use this camera. So what was it like to use this camera? I actually found this camera a lot of fun to use. It was, it's a small camera, obviously. Focusing this camera is fairly simple. I generally would use it with the magnifier raised in position, and there is a circular Fresnel lens that takes up a good portion of the center of the focusing screen. Focusing screen itself, I thought, was fairly bright and worked quite well. I might have shot 2 rolls of film with this because I do recall there being a light leak, even though I had replaced the film seals. As I was looking at my photos, I noticed there are 2 different types of photos here. One has a black border and one has a white border. The ones with the black border are the ones where I had discovered the light leak, which you can see on the right side of some of these frames. The ones with the white border, I believe that I was using the bottom half of the case, and I talk about that in a moment. So one thing that impressed me was the sharpness of the 4-element Prominar, the Tessar type. I thought to myself, you really can't go wrong with a Tessar type lens. Those lenses are just always very sharp, and I think that holds true in this case here. In the examples that I'm showing, I was using Mako 100 speed film. I like this film. I think it provides fine grain and plenty of contrast. At some point, I can't recall if it came with the camera or if I purchased it separately, but I ended up with the case for the camera. The top half was rotted, so I had to throw it away. No, no surprise. That just happens at times. So I did use the bottom of the camera, and mostly I used the bottom of the camera to provide a way to block light from entering the camera. It also gave me, I think, a bit better grip on the camera. Overall, though, I found this camera pretty easy to use, very easy, very simple to focus. I'm not a fan of the EV system, in which the shutter speed and aperture dials are locked. I think that's probably been one of the worst ideas ever. Turning the shutter speed ring is much tighter than I would like. But that's really sort of a symptom of the EV system. I can't remember if it's called EV or LV. I believe it's called EV, exposure value. Other companies called it LV, light value, essentially the same thing. It stayed in use for a while. It was supposed to be a way for you to be able to set your exposure much quicker. It would show you a number, and then you would set your your camera's shutter to that particular number. Like I said, I never really liked the system. I can't really think of many people who did. There probably were a few people who did. I found that just manually selecting shutter speeds and apertures is so easy that there was no reason to try to come in and fix it. So my rating for the Komaflex-S is 8.8. While it was generally an easy camera to use, I think that loading film is unnecessarily complicated, and I wasn't too impressed by the choice of materials for the exterior of the camera, specifically the body covering. In 1960, a 4-element Tessar type lens would be expected, so I think the lens performed admirably, as you can see from the photos. I wish that the exposure value / light value system hadn't been used for this camera, but it was. Despite comments on the internet about the durability or lack thereof of this camera, I found it to be fairly reliable. I haven't had any mechanical issues other than requiring routine service, and that would be expected of a camera from 1960. Overall, I found this camera to be very pleasant to use and would have no problem recommending it to others. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this, please think about hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you have a comment you'd like to make, please feel free to do so below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And if you're interested, you can click on this little icon down here, I believe it's right in this corner, for more content about cameras and photography. And I'll see you on the next video.